Boy, Captain Donna, First Mate Mortimer is right here. He's poised for this video. This is more Hearthstone videos talking about Naxrammas neutral cards, talking about class synergy. Let's do party card here. Dance. No dance? Dancing. Dancing Swords. Do Dancing Swords today. It's a 3-drop, 4/4. There's a death rattle. Your opponent draws a card. It's the most powerful 3-drop in the game as far as stats go, unless you count the injured Blade Master, which technically is a 4/7. But kind of a heavy tempo card. You know, getting the 4/4 out there early is pretty good. But there's the death rattle, which is that your opponent gains a card off of it, so it sucks when it dies. You know, kind of a yes, Mortimer. You like the Dancing Swords? Okay. It's a card that I would rate it pretty mediocre as far as how people think about it. When it was first discussed, a lot of people said it sucked and it was terrible and it was not worth the loss that you give to your opponent, the advantage that you give to your opponent. And then once it actually got out there and play, I think this card started to be a little better, especially in Arena. It's you know, it may be a card better than what we think. So let's take a look at the classes and see how good it is. For Druid, it's a pretty good ramp card, right? Innervating this out on turn 1. You know, you see Druids do that with Harvest Golem anyway, which is a card that is popular to be ramped out on turn 1 because it's, you know, has a death rattle, so it's heavy, it's thick, right? It's a 4/3. So this is a 4/4 that you can ramp out on turn 1. So I think that's the big synergy with Druid right there. And then if it can stick, which it probably will, you know, turn 2, drop a Mark of the Wild on it, or buff it with Power Wild if you need to, or Mark of Nature a little later. You know, you can. It fits right in with Druid with the ramp stuff because you're widening that gap, right? You're trying to get a larger advantage over where they're at and their board and their hand development, and where you are at in your board and your hand development. Cards like Innervate, cards like Wild Growth, what those do is they spread that further apart. And so when you put out a big fat minion with like a 4/4 on the first turn, then you can use the other tools that Druid has also to widen that even further. Mark the Wild, or, you know, Druid's protection stuff. You know, whatever 2-drop they put out, you can kill with Wrath. You know, whatever 3-drop they put out, you can kill with Swipe. You know, all this stuff, your bites, you know, even Claw, right? Even Claw is a card that is a 2 damage for 1 mana, and so if you get your 4/4 out, it's very unlikely your opponent's going to be able to remove that on the first turn, and so you have all these other little tools to deal with their little, even Moonfire, right? You know, these are things to keep their board dead for relatively low cost, to try and make back up the card disadvantage that you used by ramping it. People don't talk about that a lot, that ramping is a card disadvantage. Innervate is a card and you get no card back for it. Wild Growth is a card and you get no card back for it when you're using it in the early game. And in this card, Dancing Sword, you're giving a card to your opponent, so it's actually a 2-card swing if you think about it like that. So you better get the value out of the 4/4. But I think Druid has the tools to do that. I mean, even a Healing Touch, if you needed to heal it, you could. Not so great for Poison Seeds because it gives your opponent the card anyway, and it's very strong early game. It's not nearly as strong later game, and so even though the 4 health is kind of high, you're not going to be looking at doing a Savage Roar, Force of Nature combo on the first couple turns where it comes out. But everything else that Druid has, I mean, man, if you could ramp out then a Druid of the Claw on turn 2, if you could have 4/4 and a 4/6 out, right? Because first turn you could Innervate, Dancing Swords. Next turn, oh, well, you wouldn't be able to coin. Oh, no, you could, yeah. You could coin, Innervate, Druid of the Claw the next turn. That would be just monstrous. But, yeah, I think if you get it out early, Druid has a lot of things that would, you know, Keeper of the Grove, Starfall, all this stuff can pick off what minions you don't want to have on your board and kind of let you run train. Even the Hero Power, right, helps you do that too, and you can kind of run train with the 4/4. As a mid-game card, it's not nearly as good, and it's definitely outclassed by Druid's other mid-game cards, since they have Druid of the Claw and Ancient Allure, Ancient Allure. You know, those are much stronger. But so it's very strong for early game Druid, I think. But other than that, yeah, not much that's exciting. Taking a look at Hunter, it's not a beast. It's just a cheap, big minion. And you have to ask yourself, okay, how much do I really care about that in Hunter? You know, it's not something that's going to work with Hunter's Mark because it's big. You don't really want it to die. Hunter has some tools to protect their board, like Arcane Shot, like Explosive Trap, Freezing Trap, that kind of stuff. You know, that's kind of good. I think the key to this card is to get as much value out of the body as you can, so you feel satisfied with paying the price of your opponent gets to draw a card, right? And so the more I like classes that have more tools for board presence within their class sets. Freezing Trap, I think, is maybe the card that it syncs up the best with, because here they are trying to attack it with their 3/2, so their hero power can finish it off or something like that. And you know, now boom, frozen. It goes back for another turn. You get even more value out of your 4/4, out of your Dancing Swords. And it's a decent target for misdirection too, just because of the 4 attack that so early in the game. I mean, even, you know, you're dropping it on turn 3, turn 4. That's going to kill most minions on those turns, or at least damage them a lot, where Hunter can finish them off with Explosive Trap or whatever. You know, same thing with Snipe. Snipe plus this card is going to kill anything that comes out. And your cleanup stuff with Eagle Horn. You know, maybe you pull a taunt with Animal Companion to protect it. It's pretty good. That's pretty good. It's not, I mean, I wish it was a beast. Yeah, well, Hunter wishes every card was a beast, right? But you lose a lot whenever we're talking about minions that aren't beasts for Hunter, which I don't know if any of the... Haunted Creeper is the only neutral minion I can think of. Later game, I mean, something like Gladiator's Longbow is a good later game card for board control, especially because there's no life presence on it, so that strengthens it a little in the later game, I think. And Hunter has a little stronger, you know, a little stronger than Druid. They have a little bit of board stuff for later game with Explosive Shot, Gladiator's Longbow, so you get a little more value out of it, I think, when it shows up not in your opening hand with Hunter. Yep. Is it a good enough card to make a Hunter's deck list because it's not a beast? Probably not. You know, the tempo advantage on it is good, but Hunter has, I mean, it's just so tough to give up anything for that's not a beast, right? And certainly something that doesn't just damage your opponent. I don't know. It's good pressure. I haven't seen any Hunter decks yet, but might happen. Might show up. Taking a look at Mage, they, you know, getting it out early with Mage, it's good, but Mage usually has a pretty good job controlling the board anyway. Mage is a class that's built around board control. Arcane Missiles, Arcane Explosion, Ice Lance, Frost Bolt, Frost Nova, Counterspell, you know, all their Nova, Vaporize, these are all board control cards. Cone of Cold, Polymorph even for removal, Blizzard, Flame Strike. That's all, I mean, everything that they have is board control. So I would say Mage typically doesn't rely on big tempo minions to seize control of the board and to have Mortimer get in the way of everything. Buddy, come on, man. Let's take a seat. You were just sitting down. So I think the card's a little weaker in Mage because they have sweeps and, you know, they have freezes and things like that to take control of the board. You know, their best stats minion is the Water Elemental, right? But you look at how Water Elemental's built. It's not very high attack. It's got very high health. This is a control minion. It's one that's meant to freeze a particularly threatening or troublesome minion or character to stop their weapons, right? And survive because it has the 6 health for 4-drop. So a 3-drop 4/4 is good for board control in the early game. So I mean, yeah, okay, I'll say that if you drop it on turn 3 or turn 2 with the coin, then it can be good. The thing is that Mage usually can handle everything else that's on the board at that point, and when they get into the mid game is where their frosty stuff really starts rolling. So it's good, but I don't think it's great for Mage. Versus paying the downside. When I'm analyzing it within class cards, I want to see, do the class cards sync up well enough to be worth giving your opponent a card? With Mage, I think it's okay, but they're usually okay in the early game anyway, if they draw the right cards, which they have a lot of. And in the mid game, they care a lot less about board control, because they can just get it all back with Flame Strike, right? They can get board control back with one card. So a little weaker in Mage. I think definitely weaker in the end game, in mid game to late game with Mage. It's okay in the beginning. There's no class that it's going to suck in the early game for, because that's the strength of the card. But I'm not as excited about Mage. Paladin, on the other hand, is definitely exciting, because Paladin wants minions that are durable and hard to kill, like a 4/4 on turn 2 or turn 3 would be, and then they like to extract as much value as they can from them by buffing them with might to take down something bigger, to get free kills with Hand of Protection, with Argent Protector, by putting up Noble Sacrifices to protect their minions, putting up Redemption to bring their minions back to life, to Humility enemy minions to do less damage to them, Peacekeeper enemy minions to buff minions with Sword of Justice, to heal things that survive, like a 4 health minion early May with Holy Light, Blessing of Kings put on that, and then a little bit of direct damage, Holy Wrath, Hammer of Wrath, to pick off minions that are threatening. I think Paladin is similar to Druid, how it behaves with this card, that you can put it out there early, it can stick, and you have enough buffs where you can really build it higher, and your opponent may not have very good answers for it. I mean, your opponent hardly has answers for it at all when it comes out on turn 2, turn 3. And so, further than that, it can get, especially if you buffed it with like Sword of Justice or something, even one Divine Shield play with this thing would be pretty beefy. You can just, it already is going to have good value, and then you can just, Paladin has the tools to make it go higher and higher. So early game, I think it's really good in Paladin. Paladin's had some of the best early game control, because turn 4, True Silver, turn 4, Consecrate, you can take a board back completely. If you have a 4/4 minion that's still alive at that point, you're gonna be in the driver's seat for sure. Even mid game, I think it's decent for Paladin. It's not terrible, because you could bring it out and you could, if it was like turn 8, you could bring it out and immediately buff it or something, because the body on it's pretty good for is great for the mana cost. And so kind of combo drops where you bring it out and hammer, you bring it out and True Silver to clear a board, so it's on an empty board. Even in mid game, that's still not bad. Having a 4/4 minion as your sole board presence minion, or an 8/8, not too bad. And then of course when you give your opponent a card, boom, that rolls right into Divine Favor. I think this card could be real good in Paladin aggro decks, like a Shockedin, because you can put it out early, you get the benefits of all your buffs, all your Paladin stuff that you have, and then also, if it flips a card back, you could be holding on to do Divine Favor to get one more draw out of that. That's a popular card in aggro Paladins. They empty their whole hand, and then they Divine Favor to fill it back up when they're playing against control. So it actually syncs with that card, I think, pretty well, too. Your Humility plays and your Peacekeeper, I mean, those are things that really matters, bringing it down to 1, because it has 4 health, right? It doesn't have 2 health. It has 4 health. So pretty good for Paladin. Blessing of Wisdom, it's a card that's probably going to survive for 2 turns if it comes out early. So you can get maybe 2 draws off of that. Who knows? Maybe even more on the end of that. It's good. You can get it, already is going to have good value, and you can push the value even further with Paladin. So strong class forward. Priest has great synergy with its hero power. That comes to mind immediately, because it's going to be able to kill anything that's put down on the board for the first 2 turns, right? Realistically, maybe 3 turns, maybe even 4 turns. If you put a power word shield on this, talking about a 4/6, pretty early in the game with a priest behind it, that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard to deal with. It's because of the body for the stats in the early game. Priest is solid for it. I think it would be worth investing a Power Word Shield into it over a Northshire and over a Pyromancer, because that's pretty strong. You put another card in their hand. Maybe you put the card in their hand that you want to Mind Vision, right? That's not too bad. I'm just it's silly, but it mitigates some of the drawback of this card, right? You can actually at least do something with it. Or if you really don't want to give them a card, Priest has Silence, right? You have the powers to do that. If you silence it, it's still a 4/4, so it doesn't lose anything on the offensive side. It just loses the death rattle, or the drawback to it. Inner Fire Divine Spirit. It's an okay target for it. Popping it to a 4/8 on turn 3. If you coined this out and the next turn you'd have 3 mana again, you could Divine Spirit it. Or maybe the dream is Power Word Shield it and then Divine Spirit it. You'd have a 4/6. You'd have a 4/12, right? That's pretty beefy. 4 attack is good for the early game, and that health is just nuts. So. Light Whale probably would heal it because it probably is not going to die. So I like that. Dark, and you look at the early game health stuff, right? Dark Cultist, this is probably going to be the card that's still alive. So you throw it into that. Gets more health that way. There's some cool stuff that Priest can do. Maybe a little... Because of the cheap mana cost for it, it's even decent with Temple Enforcer for a later game thing. For a 9 mana play, you could have 6/6 and a 4/7 on the board. Those are two pretty good minions for 9 mana, right? If you're trying to restart the board or you just swept last turn or something like that. Yeah. If your opponent has it, then it's pain in the ass for Priest because it's 4 health, right? So you can't Shadow Word Pain, can't Shadow Word Death, can't Shadow Madness, can't Shadow Priest it. Sucks. You'd have to Holy Fire it or something like that. And it's not something that you would want to silence with Master Spell if you're against the thing. So, real good card for Priest if they get it out in the early game. And in the late game, because of the cheap mana cost, if you can combo it with a Temple Enforcer or maybe a Power Word Shield late game too, those are just as valuable, then that's not too bad. Pretty good for Priest. Rogue, I don't think it has a place in Miracle, just starting out. But an aggro Rogue, you got to take a look at what you have here. It's not something you would Shadow Step. Giving it Stealth, it's not a minion that you would typically give Stealth with Conceal or with the Master Disguise because it's kind of like why? 4 health is cool. And so maybe it might line up with the Anubar Ambusher because, if you brought that out on turn 3, you can build a deck. You can build a rogue deck. I guess more of a tempo rogue deck, right? Where you're putting down cards that have very, very good stats for the mana cost. 3-drop for a 4/4, the Dancing Swords, very good. You follow that up with a 4-drop for a 5/5. That's pretty nuts, especially if you followed if this was an arena and then your 5-drop was Venture Company, a 7/6. Your board is ridiculous at that point, right? And then even the Death Rattle here doesn't hurt it too bad because maybe it hits something and it gets knocked down to 4/2 or 4/1 and then it goes back in your hand. Like that's okay for a healing it, or maybe a Kidnapper play with it too. But you have to think about, is it worth giving your opponent a card? 2 cards on the Ambusher slide back. In a Tempo Rogue, maybe, if you really have to get some good value out of it. And maybe you do, It's got a good body, so it's not just going to be killed kind of willy-nilly by your opponent. And then, Rogue kind of shines at controlling the board and protecting minions, especially in a Rogue that's built for a tempo rogue, more of a mid-range kind of rogue, right? Because, Backstab, Deadly Poison, Betrayal, Eviscerate, Blade Fury, Sap. These are all cards. Shiv, kind of. Fan of Knives, definitely. Perditions, for sure. Assassin's Blade, Assassinate. These are all cards that are based on controlling the board to protect the minions that you have out. That's kind of how Tempo Rogue works. You put out cards with big fat stats. Your opponent can't get rid of them already because they don't have the right removal for it. And then whatever they do put out to try to work it into, a 2-for-1 or something like that, you shut them down with your other cards and you just let, your 5/5, your 4/4s run train on them. And that kind of brings you back to Cold Blood, which is the only true buff card that Rogue has. And it's, would you Cold Blood this? Yeah, maybe. I talk a lot about how Cold Blood is typically used for lethal combos on things with charge, on damage that is going to happen. But a 4/4 coming out early, depending on the class that you're playing, depending on if you've kind of figured out what deck they have, turning that into an 8/4 for the first couple turns, especially if you have backstabs and deadly poisons to back it up, yeah, you can do a lot of damage real fast with this card, especially if you get your ambusher out there too. You can put a lot of damage even by turn 5. You can bring them below 15 at that point, and then they have to be worrying about Assassin's Blade and Eviscerate and all the typical finisher things that Rogue has. So in a tempo Rogue, I think it's good. In an aggro Rogue, maybe. It's an aggressive body. It's just Rogue, you kind of have to just balance. How much do I care about giving him a card? Tempo Rogue has problems against control, right? And so maybe that's an issue, giving a control deck a card, because maybe they draw that taunt, right? But you can kind of adjust to it depending on what you have in your hand. Let's talk about Shaman. Shaman is Shaman, like Paladin, like Druid, I think if they get it out early, then they want to pull as much value as they can out of it, right? Healing Tide Totem actually comes to mind first off with Shaman because of the 4 health, right? On that turn, you can kill something. There are other things that have 4 health on the 2-drop and on the 3-drop. We saw the Gargoyle, Warriors, Armor Smith, and something else. The Web Lord, right? Those have 4 health, but they only have like 1 attack. So with the Healing Tide Totem, you could be knocking that stuff down and getting it healed back up. Or you could even knock down a 2/3 and it still gets healed back to a 4/3. You're going to get value out of the Healing Tide Totem if that comes on turn 2 and then the Dancing Sword comes on turn 3. That's not too bad. Ancestral Healing is the same thing. Being able to heal this, being able to give it taunt, that can actually give you good board control. I think that's there. And if there's a minion that is going to come out that looks like it's going to kill it, you can shock it with Frost Shock. You can do a lot of things and clean it up with. Shaman, kind of like Hunter, actually has a lot of tools that they can protect minions that they want to keep alive on the board. Forked Lightning, both the shocks, Rock Biter, Lightning Bolt, the Axe, Lightning Storm. Hex, kind of. Even Feral Spirit, right? That's kind of a board control card. It's good because you could put this out. They have a problem. Your opponent needs to get rid of it, and yet you have all this lightning crap to prevent them from doing that. Let your 4 damage minion run wild while they're scrambling to do anything. And if you can heal it while it's doing damage to stuff, then even better. Even better. Bringing it back with Ancestral Minion, or with Ancestral Spirit. This is a card that isn't popular super for the early game, but you do see it sometimes, right? You see this put on Injured Blade Masters from time to time, and other cards that just have really good stats for their mana cost. I mean, this has even better stats than the Blade Master. So, yeah, maybe Ancestral Spirit on it on the next turn. Yeah, that's not terrible. An early Wind Fury, you can actually load up a lot of damage early on this card if your opponent doesn't have an answer for it. And because of the body on the card, maybe they're not going to have an answer for it. So, Wind Fury, put it next to Flame Tongue. I mean, all these, the damage can get pretty out of control. Rock Biter on it, it can get pretty good. Wind Speaker, that's the card that gives Wind Fury. In mid-game, I think it's actually still okay in Shaman for mid-game, and maybe even the later game. You know, Shaman has Overload, right? The entire Overload mechanic works where they give you a card that's very powerful for its mana cost, but then you have to deal with the downside on the next turn. This card sort of has an overload in that its stats are way better than what its mana cost is, but you have that downside to it. But, you know, you look at the other cards that Shaman has, Doomhammer, Earth Elemental, Feral Spirit, you know, those cards are great for Dust Devil. Okay, not the same thing, but those cards are really good stats for their mana cost, and so this card is as well. You know, Shaman, sometimes the mid game is designed around getting value out of the budgets that these cards have, and so I don't know why Fire Elemental doesn't have Overload, and so this card, I think, kind of syncs up with that. You know, it's just more, you know, it's more tempo advantage for Shaman, and if you can protect it with your Shaman stuff that you can do, then it could be a pretty good card. Taking a look at Warlock, you know, Warlock is a class that when you're analyzing it, you know, there's no really decks in the meta. There's no tempo Warlock. There's no mid-range Warlock. You have a very fast Warlock deck with Zoo, or you have a very slow Warlock deck with Control, with Handlock, right? And so, you know, this card, I kind of analyze it in regards to that. It's not a demon, so there's no sacrificial pact. Every time, just hoping. And, you know, there's not a lot of cards that really buff anything that Warlock has. Power Overwhelming. Power Overwhelming is a card that you're going to want to put on minions that survive, right? Or Leroy to kill them with a combo. And so this would be a monster. If this card, if you were like Aggro Warlock and you were playing against Handlock, you know, you could take down a giant with this. That's pretty good, right? So it's an interesting target for Power Overwhelming just because of the reach. You look at it, something that can do 8 attack pretty early in the game, right, Mortimer? Right? Is your power overwhelming? Is your nap overwhelming? I think it is. Okay. But they don't have much that really buffs things other than that. It survives a Hellfire hit. It would cost 1 mana off a summoning portal. I mean, that's pretty awesome. But, you know, control-wise, in Handlock, I don't really think it's that great because Handlock doesn't really care about pressure and tempo. It's just dropping, it's waiting for openings so it can drop huge minions, right, that are worth their cost. They're just some of the biggest minions in the game. And so you don't see a lot of mid-range minions. You don't see a lot of early-game minions with Handlock. With Zoo, however, yeah, you know, this is another aggressive card that's there. It's a huge tempo advantage card. You get it early. A 3-drop is a little high for Zoo, right? You're really going to be mulliganing for your 1-drops and your 2-drops. But if you see this, is that worth 3 mana on your 3 turn? Yeah, probably. Pretty good. If you could drop that and a Soulfire to clear whatever's off, and you have 4/4 on an open board, and you're playing Zoo, that's pretty solid. You know, you can kind of think of this card as another demon, and the demons are pretty valuable to Warlock in general, though they are used a little less in Zoo. You know, look at demons, and most of them have really good stats for their budget, but they have a drawback, right? That's kind of, you know, you pay that demonic price. Flame Imp with the damage, Succubus you discard, Felguard you lose a mana, Void Terror you actually lose creatures, Pit Lord wrecks you, Doomguard with the discard. You know, so it's kind of like that. It's a card that I think is very similar to Succubus, really similar to Flame Imp, that you get crazy good stats for it, and you just have to ask yourself, is it worth the drawback, you know? Succubus kind of isn't, because it's a 4/3, so you discard a card and then a 2-drop can kill it, a 3/2 can kill it, so it's kind of a 2-for-1. Flame Imp typically is worth it because you don't care about your life total that much. It's usually valued as the least valuable resource for Warlock. And so, you know, the death rattle on this, is it worth giving your opponent another card? Um, yeah, I think so. I'm a little surprised I haven't seen this card in Zoo as much as I thought it would be, because to me it seems like it would fit in there great. Maybe you have to make a decision about what comes out for it, but I mean the stats are the bomb for a 3-drop. And it doesn't hurt Felguard doesn't show up that much because it hurts your tempo a lot, right? But this card doesn't. It gives your opponent a benefit, but how big of a benefit is that really if you're looking at killing them on turn 6 or turn 7? So I think good in an early. It seems to line up with the minion style and the play style that Warlocks have in the early game. Late game, I don't think nearly as good. Taking a look at Warrior, they like minions with higher health because they like to be able to take damage. In the way that their minion stat budget works is, you look at Armorsmith, right? It's a unique in that it's a 1/4. It previously was the only 1/4 that was a 2-drop, and they give you higher health for a little lower attack. Frothing Berserker, you get high health for 3-drop. 4 health is really high. But you get a little lower attack, right? You got your 2/3 there. The Korkon's obviously an aggressive card, but even Grommash, right? High health, very high health, lower attack. And the reason is because these are cards that you're supposed to damage. Warrior's supposed to take damage. Grommash with the Enrage, Frothing Berserker with its persistent ability to get bigger, and Armorsmith with its armor stuff. And so taking damage through Whirlwinds, through Inner Rage, through drawing off Battle Rage, being able to survive down for Commanding Shout, buffing them with Rampage, buffing them with Taskmaster, slamming your own guys when needed, being able to combo into a charge with the Warsong Commander. That's why Warrior likes lower attack minions with higher health, because when they take damage, they can do things. This card has a huge benefit in that it has high health and it has high attack. Warrior, one of the most frustrating cards people play against in Warrior is the Fiery War Axe, because it allows Warrior to do just so much damage right in the early game, right? When people are trying to establish their early board. The War Axe, follow up with a Cleave. I mean, your opponent's pretty dead as far as the early game is concerned, a War Axe alone. And so you think about putting this card out there, it's a 4/4. Think about that. Turn 1, let's say you're going first, right? And so you come to turn 2, War Axe, right? You kill whatever they put out. You kill whatever 3-drop they put, 2-drop they put out. Next turn, they put out another 2-drop. You kill it with the War Axe, and boom, you drop a 4/4 as well. So now they're dealing with a 4/4 on an empty board. They're down 2 early game cards. You're down 1, and you have a pretty beefy minion there. And if you have a Heroic Strike or a Cleave or Commanding Shout, or anything that can protect the card, yeah, that's if you got Death's Bite, I think you, just because of Warrior's weapons, you can get more value out of this card than how it just drops. The Paladin, Druid, Shaman, it's the buffs that widen the gap that you can get with this card and getting more value out of it. With Warrior, it's the weapons, because those are their primary tools for controlling the board. There's a little synergy, I think, with Charge here, because Charge kind of sucks now that it got moved to 3 mana. It used to be 0. But Charge is a great card to combo with minions that you drop, right? You always would do that, otherwise it would be pointless to play Charge unless you really needed that extra attack for some reason. But this card is 3 mana. Charge is another 3 mana. So for a 6 mana drop, you're dropping a 6/4 Charge. Combine that, look at another 6 mana drop, which is the Argent Commander, right? That's a 4/2 Charge. Well, this is a 6/4. I mean, it's stronger than Leroy for 2 more mana. That's pretty good. And because Charge takes some of your tempo to set up, but because this card has such a low cost, it's ideal for something like this, because you can play that, play Charge on it, and then you can still even do other stuff on your turn. So Warrior, I think, still has the tools. And then if you're playing a control Warrior, running your opponent out of cards is pretty simple. It's pretty important. That's usually how you win the game. But you also usually have a lot of cards yourself, so if they draw one more card, you usually can kind of deal with that. You know, Control Warrior is built on having all the answers that you need because you're playing so slowly and using your hero power so much. In an Aggro Warrior, it's just, you know, it's a really it's a lot of stats, right? In your Face Warrior, you're typically going to face with all the things, you know, all the just crazy damage stuff Warrior can load on early. War Axe, Heroic Strike, Taskmaster, Charge, even. Not really Rampage, but and then, you know, that weapon, Mortal Strike, that Charge guy, that weapon, finish him with Gorehowl. So you want minions that put a lot of pressure. Bloodsail Raider, the 2/3 that's Battle Cry, it gains the attack of your weapon. That's popular in Warrior because you get great stats for a 2-drop. In this card, you get great stats for a 3-drop. So I think in both types of Warrior that this card could be, you know, it could line up okay. Control Warrior, maybe you don't need to put pressure on them early, but it's something. Overall, analyzing this card, as you analyze any card that has a drawback on it, right? That has a good side and a bad side. The good side's great, and everybody's excited about that. But you have to really question, you know, what do I do? What's the downside of it worth, right? How much is that worth to me? If the downside of a card was when this card dies, you die. You know, it wouldn't even matter if the card was like a 25-0 charge, or nobody would play it because it's just, well, maybe if it was a 25-0 charge, but you know, it's just too risky. So this card, you have to ask yourself, can I get enough value out of this card to be worth giving up a card? Which mathematically means you got to have it be at least a 2-for-1, right? Because it's going to die, so you're going to lose a card. Your opponent loses a card if you go 1-for-1, and then they gain a card on you. So you want a 2-for-1. You really want to try to get a 3-for-1 out of this card to really feel good about the value that you get, since most of the good value cards in the game are ones that are 2-for-1. So I kind of rank the classes based upon that. I think it's really good for Druid with the ramps, and they can get a lot of value out of it. I think it's really good for Paladin. They can get out of it. I think it's really good for Warrior, especially Aggro Warrior, because they can kind of, and I think it's really good for Priest. I put Priest a little above Warrior. I'd say my top is going to be Druid, Paladin, Priest, and Shaman. I think those 4 have the tools to really get, either through buffs or board control, you know, those are really good for, in kind of all around, for a good early game pressure card that's still okay in the late game. And I think you can get the value out of it. After that, probably Rogue and Warrior and Warlock, where it's still good, and these classes do have tools to get as much value as you can out of this card, but it's a little restrictive on the style of play. You know, Rogue outside of Temple Rogue is not going to be that great. Warlock outside of Zoo isn't going to be that great. Warrior outside of like an aggressive Warrior deck isn't going to be that great. And in the bottom, it's, you know, it's not a bad card for Hunter or for Mage, right? I could see it in either one of those decks at some point just because of the tempo advantage, but I don't think the class cards in particular line up that great with it. You know, Hunter has some limited things to kind of protect it, to get value out of it. Mage also has some limited things. I'd put those two sort of on the bottom, you know. Will the card become more popular in time? I think so. I think it will, especially if the metagame shifts more towards tempo-based decks, especially mid-range type decks. Then this could be a very strong early card. You know, people are really frightened of the death rattle on it, and it's just, you know, it's hard to analyze because you don't know what cards your opponent drew. You know, maybe they drew something pointless, like a dead card, but maybe they drew Ragnaros, or maybe they drew Leroy Jenkins. You know, there is some risk there. So it's just have to see how it evolves. I think it'll be a little more popular than it is as things go along. So it'll be exciting to see. We'll talk about more cards soon. Smooth sailing, everybody.